All right, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, here we go. Hello and welcome to the Remaining Sane, Finding Peace in Our Chaos podcast, a podcast about both theology and police work. I'm your host, Will, and in today's episode, I talk with Dr. Michael McClymond, a professor at St. Louis University. Dr. McClymond, how are you today?
I'm doing just fine. How are you
Good.
doing?
Good. Would you mind giving a brief background as to who you are, the kind of academic work that you do, just a brief 2-3 minutes about yourself?
Sure. I have been a professor now for more than 25 years, actually almost 35 years if you include earlier institutions where I was affiliated. I did my training at Northwestern, Yale, and the University of Chicago, was a research chemist originally. So I left scientific research and to go to seminary and do PhD work in religion and theology. And then I taught at Wheaton College, at Westmont, which is another evangelical college, University of California, San Diego, St. Louis University, and then briefly also at some other, was affiliated with Emory, Yale, University of Birmingham, it's in England rather than Alabama, and the University of Berlin most recently. So I probably have been best known for my work on Jonathan Edwards, the early American thinker, co-wrote a large book on him. Actually did a couple books, but a large co-authored book with Gerald McDermott, which is called The Theology of Jonathan Edwards. I've worked on, after working on Edwards, worked on religious revivals movements in North America, edited the Encyclopedia of Religious Revivals, another edited collection. And then I have work kind of eclectically. I've done some work in biblical studies. When I was at University of California, San Diego, David Noel Friedman, who is a well-known Hebrew Bible scholar, recruited me, and I wrote a chapter that became a short book on the life of Jesus called Familiar Stranger. More recently, I have been best known for my work as a critique of Christian Universalism, the doctrine that everyone will finally be saved. And so that came out in a 2-volume work called The Devil's Redemption, and it's about 1,300 pages in the 2 volumes. And then most recently, I have published a general introduction to Christian spirituality called Martyrs, Monks, and Mystics. So, and then beyond that, at St. Louis University, where I've been outside of the brief stints at other universities, I have been teaching undergraduate courses, but also directing PhD students. I've had a total of about 15, and a number of them are professors in different places as well. So there's a brief overview.
Okay. Well, speaking about your work on universalism, one of the things that has really struck me about Christian Universalism as a whole, and trying to be charitable to people that ascribe to Universalism, specifically Christian Universalism, is that there is I would say, a distinct lack of encountering the world viscerally for some of these people that ascribe to a broad Christian Universalism, because you're not. And because of that, it makes you kind of okay with the idea that all people will go to heaven, even the ones that how horrible things that they have done. And this is something you've talked about before, that the Devil Redeemed is an inherently provocative title for your book, because it essentially, you're saying that the devil will be redeemed if you believe that God will redeem everyone.
Yes.
And so one of the problems, and I think the more that you work with real people in settings that like police officers or firefighters, or people that really interact with people on a day-to-day visceral basis, you see some just horrible people doing horrible stuff, and it's very counterintuitive for you to say that that person is going to be will be redeemed at the end. In fact, it for some stuff that that you've seen this person commit heinous, horrible, atrocious acts over and over, it kind of makes you depressed if you don't think that they are going to have to account for their own sins, right?
Well, what you're saying, Will, is very much in line with the article that I did, an online article that probably got more response than the book, which was so extensive. The article is called "The Opiate of the Theologians," and so what I'm arguing there, in effect, this is published online with First Things, which is pretty well known, New York-based journal of religion and politics. But what I was arguing is that universalism is a way that we might want the world to be, that everyone gladly receives the glad news, and yet I use the analogy of like the triumphal entry of Jesus. Everyone is cheering, everyone's happy. Can't we just play that loop endlessly? Wouldn't it be wonderful if we just could stay there forever? Well, guess what? The gospel tells us that Jesus was crucified just days after that. And of course, we have every reason to think that some of the people who are shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna, later cried out, crucify him. And so the gospel story is unsentimental. It doesn't really allow us to neglect the reality of human hardness of heart. Also, John chapter 3 is very clear. John 3, before John 3:16, just after John 3:16, it says, this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world and men love the darkness rather than the light. And in that same text, it talks about those who come to the light and those who flee from the light. And so this is the reality of the world we're living in. You have to imagine a different kind of world where, there are no enemies, there are only friends, and then there are the friends we're yet to make, because, discussion, face-to-face encounter, loving gestures are going to be reciprocated. And if you try to apply this in a political and police setting, it'd be like saying, that Hitler needed a hug, Stalin needed a friendly hello, and if they had just received that, then maybe they wouldn't have become mass murderers and invaded the neighboring countries. And again, it's a very sentimentalized view of human nature and human life. It doesn't fit with the record of history at all, as you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Nor does it fit with the everyday reality of, I would argue, people that have to work in these kind of environments. Don't get me wrong. When I say have to work, I really do enjoy my work. However, I've talked about in this podcast before, I have walked in on some pretty horrible stuff happening. And, the idea that, hey, I'm just going to be the friend to that dude who, has sex with little kids. I'm no, that person has to pay for that. And in some way or another. And that doesn't mean that God can't redeem that person, but that does mean that that person's life has a whole lot of fixing to do.
Right. Yes, I see that pretty clearly. And although this isn't the focus of our discussion today, I think the recent events in just this month, this last month with Israel and Hamas, have sort of kind of underscored this point about the reality of evil, and that there's some who don't seem reconcilable.
Right.
People say, let's war solves nothing. Let's resort in diplomacy. Well, diplomacy, not everyone is amenable to a diplomatic solution if their aims are ultimately irreconcilably set against the welfare of other people. If my aim is to destroy another human being or another group, then I might not be. It might be impossible for me to be reconciled.
Correct. Yeah, that's. We even see that all the time on a day-to-day scale. There are some people out there, and this has been highlighted in the past 10 years, that their entire reason for which they exist is to harm or to undermine the institution, the police. And that, hey, just like anybody else, I do have qualms with policing itself today, but I don't exist in order to try to destroy that thing. And people like that are just they're inside of police work. You also see this as well, that there are some people, most people you can reason with if you have to arrest them. You can go up to him and say, hey, I got to arrest you. You're going to jail for having 0.5 gram of meth in your pocket. Oh, well. But there are some people that, even though you are looking at them doing something illegal, they are going to fight you into cuffs and then fight you all the way to jail and then fight you at the jail and then fight the jailers at booking and all of this. So because they're just not going to listen to reason.
There's also a phenomena that the psychologists call sincere lying. There are different degrees of being separated from truth, and this actually has a spiritual application as well. If someone shoplifts, let's say the owner of the 7-Eleven or the mini mart sees someone putting things in their pocket, says, I saw you shoplift. They said, no, I didn't. That's I would consider that sort of ordinary deception. But what if the person is just shoplift and they look back at you and they immediately shoot back, no, I didn't shoplift it. I bought this a week ago, but I left the receipt at home and I don't have it with me. You'd think first reaction is like, wow, that person really came up with a lie really quickly. But what if you could look into that person's eyes and see that they believed the lie that they had just spontaneously come up with? Now, that's what the psychologists call sincere lying. And it's also tied with the so-called psychopathic personality. And there are people that are so far into deception that they come up with lies like that and they believe their own lies. And it's very difficult to bring that person out of this realm of darkness and deception into truth. And I think when Jesus says that men love the darkness rather than the light, I think that's what he's getting at on the spiritual level, that there's some who have lived in the darkness so long that the light is hateful to them and they prefer to be in a dark realm, and they don't you can lay out all the evidence, lay it out in front of them and deny. These are people that will do everything they can to push the evidence away and ignore it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is something that we encounter so much. The failure to I guess just even recognize the physical evidence that may be in front of them. Well, moving to a different topic, one of the things that you have written about, or at least talked about most recently, is the idea of a hero. And being a police officer, sometimes, because we do have to go after danger, sometimes, if you do a heroic act, you can, as a police officer, be looked at as a hero. Now, just because you are a police officer doesn't mean that you are a hero inherently, but there are simple acts that you can do that embody heroism, mainly going after danger towards something that needs to be done. Despite fear or despite even injury that you may receive, or, despite even having to die for doing that thing, that is still inherently a heroic act. Would you mind talking more about the theory that you have been putting together with this Plutarchian versus this Campbellian hero? Just explaining what those two terms are and kind of going into that.
Sure. Well, first of all, I think that the notion of the hero and the heroic, whatever, and of course there are different terms that would be used in different times and places, but I think it's sort of hardwired into our human nature, because I don't think there's any culture in the world that doesn't honor that person who brings danger on themselves in order to rescue and deliver other people from the danger and harm coming toward them. You find this from ancient times all the way up to the present, from the stories of ancient, Greek heroes, Greco-Roman era. Of course, there's a lot. Plutarch is the first century, Greek author, Greek language author who recorded the deeds of the noble, Greeks and Romans. But you could trace it all the way to, more recently, of course, stories of 9/11 and those that did not run from the buildings, the towers after they were hit, but ran into them or toward them in order to rescue people. And those stories resonate with not just with people, in North America, but people all around the world are attracted to stories like that. The distinction that I drew out in this recent talk on heroism is between the hero in Plutarch's writing and the hero in Joseph Campbell. One of the main distinctions is that the hero in Plutarch in the classical era, the Greco-Roman era, is facing off against some publicly acknowledged danger. So there could be an enemy invasion. I use the example of the 300 Spartans who held the line against, we don't know the exact number, but it may have been a couple 100,000 Persian invaders. And of course, they fought to the death. All of them, none of them survived. They knew they were not going to come out of this alive, but they held off the Persians long enough for the Greeks to regroup. And although they died in that encounter at Thermopylae, famous episode of the 300 Spartans, nonetheless, Greece did win against Persia. And of course, that was a pivotal time in world history because Greek culture respected individuality and had a role for participatory government. And Persia, by contrast, was an absolute Oriental despotism. And so if Persia had won, it'd be like imagining, a world if Stalin or Hitler, were over the world system rather than governments that respected their individual freedom and so on. So that in that case, the struggle is with an external foe. Joseph Campbell, who wrote this book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, went into world mythology, and what he came out with something rather different, that the ultimate goal of the heroic journey was self-realization. And there was an outward journey and then some encounter with outward circumstances, and then there's kind of the returning, coming back with a deeper sense of selfhood. And I think even in the superhero movies that we have, I was talking with someone the other day about like the Batman movie, and I remember watching the Batman shows growing up. I mean, the old ones from the 1960s and 70s, but the more recent Batman movies, it's like they play up the traumatic history of Batman. And so Batman is, or in some cases other superheroes, they're on the verge of exercising their superpowers, right, to help other people. And then suddenly something emerges, but it comes from within them. There's some like inner impediment. And it's as if the whole sphere of struggle has been shifted from the external world to this internal realm. It's almost inward shift. And so I think the classical idea of the heroes is something we need to recover, because honestly, we live in a world where there are external threats. It isn't all internalized. And we need people that are willing to even to bring themselves into a situation of danger for the sake of the greater good of society and others around them.
Yeah. Two things stick out to me what you're saying. Number one is that I think C.S. Lewis actually makes and I can't remember where he makes this realization or where he writes it, but that heroes were changing from overcoming an external problem in order to become heroic to using their heroic supernatural capabilities in order to overcome like an internal problem with themselves. Well, now that I'm thinking about this, I can't remember if it's Chesterton or if it's C.S. Lewis that brings this up. And that this is and one of the critiques that I've heard about this is that this is kind of like a phenomenon inside of sci-fi, that all the whole difference between sci-fi and fantasy is that sci-fi has computers, but there's more to it. I think that sci-fi tries to find God in humanity, whereas the fantasy literary worlds a lot of times trying to have the external gods or a god. But anyways, the second thing that stuck out to me is that being a police officer, one of the things that you really get a lot of people, whether they acknowledge it or not, get nervous about is active shooter scenarios, and the reality of modern training for police officers when it comes to active shooter scenarios. In modern policing in 2021 or 2023, most departments teach what's called a direct to threat response. And so what that means is if you're hearing gunshots going off inside of a building and there's multiple people and God forbid there's all kinds of people getting shot, you're taught to not wait on your backup, but to just go in and try to handle the shooter. And having trained for that and having drilled for it, and then myself having acted as the bad guy for training other people, that really is a nerve-wracking thing that I'm thinking about. Maybe I'm going to have to do this one day, and it's going to be on me to take the shooter down because I'm the first one there. And it is, I think, only through a hero that you're describing, like a Plutarchian hero, that's going to be able to overcome that. Because, I'm a police officer. I've got, what makes me special? Almost nothing. I've got extra training. I've got this little vest. I've got, 20 pounds of gear. That's it. I don't have like some kind of crazy supernatural ability. I'm just a normal guy. But it is through doing a heroic act that a cop could reach that heroic status, right?
This was an issue, I believe, with the Uvalde, Texas scenario, right?
Yes. Yeah. If you take Uvalde and you compare it to Nashville,
or for that matter, the Parkland shooting with the man who was outside who didn't enter the building. But in Uvalde, we know that, that there were people that were waiting. They made this independent determination that there was no further risk and therefore didn't go in, tried to wait out the situation. And actually, there were parents who tried themselves to go to rescue their own children who were blocked from entering the area. Now, one of the things that strikes me here is that heroic action flows ultimately out of a heroic culture and heroic mentality. If you have a society that does not encourage that, then it's much less likely that you're going to get individuals, whatever their training. I mean, how much money do you need to pay someone in their salary to convince them that that they need to put their life on the line in order to rescue other people? A heroic culture like we had in ancient times was one where those that took on the risk of danger and even of death for themselves in order to rescue others, that was highly honored and highly valued. And actually, you read through earlier American literature too. I mean, I have this collection of from the 19th century called American Patriotism, and it's just a lot of speeches and a lot of this recognized the patriots who had fought and shed their blood and given their lives, for the sake of the republic and the freedom that we enjoy. And those are, I think we give lip service to that today, but I'm not sure that we really have a heroic culture for the most part around us.
Yeah. And I think part of it is, well, I'm going to rephrase it at the very beginning. Well, this is an across the board phenomenon for both police and for military. and even for firefighters, and to a lesser extent to EMS, that we don't have a lot of people that are willing to step up and say, hey, put my life on the line. I want to go forward and do this. That culture just doesn't exist nearly to the degree that it once did, at least that I believe it did. And what's funny is one of the things that I do at the department I work at is I help teach some of the police academies. And one of the things I try to do with each police academy is I try to ask them, all the people that are learning, the trainees, cadets, whatever you want to call them, why they want to be a police officer. And this most recent class, I had 2 or 3 of them specifically say that it was because of the Nashville shooting that they wanted to, that was part of the impetus why they wanted to become police officer. That they wanted to put their lives in the line like how those officers did. And that's very admirable, I think.
Well, I'm glad you brought up a positive example, because that shows that people still respond, that there's not just a negative contagion. There could be a positive affirmation, reinforcement when people see another person acting heroically. Mm-hmm. We know that like in the psychology of military warfare, that one person's courage, a small number of people, sometimes just one person, like the commanding officer who leads the charge, so to speak, I'm going to be the first to go to face the enemy. That has tremendous emotional, psychological power for the men that are following an officer. If they see their officer is not withholding himself, but putting himself on the line. All the great commanders like Alexander the Great and Napoleon. Well, I call they're great. I mean, like, we could debate the political merits of people that invaded other countries, but they were renowned military leaders, in part because their men, they had great loyalty among the men, because the men saw that they themselves took on the hardships that they expected the men to take upon, and the dangers that they expect the men to enter into. Mm-hmm. And that Alexander and Napoleon weren't willing to they were willing to endure and suffer and face the same issues that their men under them were going to face.
Yeah, that's a big thing that I think a lot of departments are going through right now, is that there's almost this class of command staff inside of bigger departments. The bigger the department is, the worse this department gets. The problem becomes that there's professional desk duty people that you're a high ranking X, Y, and Z, but you haven't actually been on the street in 10, 15 years, and so you don't actually know what it's like to be out there, and so it leads to just a lot of disconnect between the people that work for you and your office. And I think that command staff that actually gets out there and does stuff, that builds just a ton of respect and camaraderie around for everyone else. Well, so along those lines, one of the questions that I have for you is that how do we cultivate some of those heroic virtues? Let's say we're not a police officer, right? Your job is being an academic. How do we cultivate some of those virtues in order to have some of the traits of being a hero?
Well, as I had suggested in the talk that I gave, that you got to hear recently, I think we need to, first of all, to begin with the narrative element, the stories themselves. That I think, and I'm thinking especially younger males, boys growing up, they need to hear the stories. There's some of them are ancient stories. There are biblical stories of heroism. I think the story of David and Goliath has never gone out of fashion. because I think everyone can identify with it, the idea of the little guy against this overwhelming, force against him, who nonetheless shows courage. And of course, Israel, which had been so demoralized by Goliath and the challenge he had. Of course, he'd been taunting, the armies of Israel. The whole situation is reversed because of David's heroism. So I think the biblical stories, I believe in the power of some of these ancient stories that are not as well known out of authors like Plutarch. And then American history is very rich in these kinds of stories as well. I suppose we could find these in European history as well, but I think here in North America, we can start with some of our own earlier history, the Revolutionary War era, the Civil War era, probably earlier American history. I really think once in perhaps World War II, once we get after World War II, the Korean conflict, of course, Vietnam is a real turning point because of so many who participated in that had doubts about the wisdom and prudence of the war itself, whether it was a necessary war or war of choice for the U.S. And I'm not trying to resolve that. I think there are still many conflicting opinions. I don't think in the case of World War II that there are too many people who have that question in their mind, whether it was necessary to oppose Hitler with everything we could throw at him. So starting with the stories, but then there need to be real life situations where individuals engage with others in significant ways. And I don't have a real detailed roadmap in terms of how to do that. Obviously, we don't create situations where they're dangerous. We don't ignite a building on fire in order to train young men to go and rescue the people in the building. But I do think we can look into situations where there may be risk and some degree of risk and danger involved. I'm involved every week in prayer walking in actually what's literally the most dangerous street in the USA. And I'm not trying to turn myself into a hero here. I'm just saying that living in St. Louis, which is in recent years had the highest homicide rate in the US, I felt drawn to this neighborhood. And actually it's Grand Avenue. There've been more homicides per capita on about this 2-mile stretch of road than anywhere else in the U.S. Now, I don't go there on Friday and Saturday night. I would consider that very foolhardy that we go early Saturday morning, but we go into this neighborhood. We pray with people in the neighborhood. We actually have gone to the sites of shootings, and the Lord opens doors for us to minister to people in this neighborhood. And we have, just last week, we had a woman come up and said she'd been off of fentanyl for 45 days. We had prayed with her. So we have experiences that, I live in a suburban area. I don't live in this kind of area where there's sounds of shooting at night. But I think getting outside of our area of comfort into kind of the frontline areas where there are issues of abuse and violence and drug addiction and so on, that's where we can really learn what it means in our culture to show at least some measure of courage.
Yeah.
And learn and maybe retrain ourselves rather than trying to run away from any kind of risk or danger, to actually put ourselves in those situations where we might have some new kinds of experiences. Also, look at the world in a different way from the point of view of those who do live in the neighborhoods where there's sounds of shooting and gangs are active.
One of the things that I have started incorporating into my life more recently is fasting. And I think that fasting is also something, it's a very small thing, but I have a day in the week where I don't touch dairy, or I really don't have any seasonings. I don't have any processed sugar. Really try to stay away from processed food. So mainly it's just rice and some kind of vegetable for that whole day. And that helps recenter you and not always give into, wanting to have that good tasting piece of chocolate cake, or to have a pie, or, ribs or whatever. It helps you order yourself so that you can be more disciplined with your choices. And I think another example that comes up is just doing physical things that are hard to do.
Yes.
Today it was raining outside, and I was supposed to run for today. And there's two options here. I can either not run because it's raining, or I can go run despite the rain. And so I decided to go run, even though it wasn't fun, and I got wet and it was cold. But it trains you to do things that you don't want to do, but you still have to do them. And I think that doing that constantly and not just doing what's easy is always a good virtuous thing to do. And I think that young men especially need that, because American culture and American society, because of the ways that we are blessed, it is very easy to not have to do very physically hard things if we don't want to, especially if we live in a suburban area like you were talking about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, to sit on your couch and, every meal is going to be an Uber Eats that's delivered to your door. You need to walk only 10 paces to the door to get the food. And then you're binging on Netflix. Unfortunately, some young men are watching porn, and playing video games and smoking weed. It's like, you're living that life. You are not prepared for self-denial for the sake of a higher good, whether that's helping to rescue someone else who's in danger, their house is on fire, there's an intruder at their house, or even for your own life. The idea that saying no in order to say yes to something else. I have a chapter on Martyrs, Monks, and Mystics, a new book that's just come out called Saying No and Letting Go. And it centers on so-called ascetical theology, which is this idea that in order to say yes to God and God's purposes, we have to say no to certain things. And C.S. Lewis said something very similar to what you said, is that he used the idea of military training. Why do we have boot camp, in which people are put through various kinds of deprivation? He said that it's a training for the actuality of a war situation. When you may be in a battle where there's no opportunity to stop and eat anything for 48 hours. And if you've already trained your body through fasting, you're ready for that kind of a deprivation. Or going without sleep for a period of time. Fasting, vigils, these were all done in the early church. The Desert Fathers, Desert Mothers practiced these as part of their devotion to the life of prayer. And they used the language of like being spiritual athletes, just as there's ordinary athleticism, I guess, and there's the Olympic athlete. The Olympic athlete, what their regimen seems crazy, right, to most people, like getting up at 3 or 4 in the morning, and then just these long runs and, extreme focus on what they eat and don't eat, and multiple, exercise sessions each day. But they realize that they have to train at that level in order to perform at a higher level. And if you think about that, if you didn't know about the Olympic Games, you think this person is just a masochist or just trying to suffer as much as they can. If you understand where they're trying to get to in terms of their physical performance, it totally makes sense. And I think there's a spiritual analog to that. I think that there is a kind of no pain, no gain principle that applies to the spiritual life.
Yeah. And if it's this is something that doing family prayer with my whole family is so crucial. And that it's easy for us to okay, we're only going to pray at dinner because we're all together at dinner, and that's it. But doing an actual liturgical formal prayer every day and carving out time to do that with my wife and my child, that's harder, but it's a better thing to do. And simply because it is just, I wouldn't say it's more inconvenient, but it does inconvenience you to do something like that. Well, I've got one more question for you here. And this is along the lines of young men in modern American society. We've talked about this a little bit, but how does our loss of an idealized hero affect our younger male generation? Unfortunately, I had good parents that taught me what being a man looks like, and then also, my job has taught me a lot about that as well. But how does our slow, gradual loss of heroism, of an ordered heroism, how has that affected our youngest generation of men?
Well, I think we see the effects of that pretty clearly, and there's a growing literature. If I had time, I could run through about half a dozen books on this. Christina Hoff Sommers, The War Against Boys, and Richard Reeves of Boys and Men. There's quite a literature that has emerged about the lack of motivation, direction in the lives of young men today. We see this in things like college performance. The percentage of college enrollees who are male has dipped below the number of women. That women are, they are not only completing college with higher grade points, they are getting more master's degree in general than young men are. And this is really, for the first time in the last few years, people are looking at this and seeing this as a really dangerous social trend, that that so many younger men are unmotivated and directed. So I think the lack of any kind of call to self-denial for the sake of a greater good is very demoralizing to young men. And I think, I mean, the irony is that, like, you have to ask for more to get more. It's like by asking for less and less and less, it has this demoralizing effect. And then there's this bifurcation, the opposite direction, the young men that are tuned in to, like, Andrew Tate. And what Tate presents is this very self-assertive, but also ultimately self-centered picture of kind of hyper masculinity, where we regard other, we simply push forward with whatever we want, and women are there to do our bidding and to be subordinate to us, and we can use them sexually if we want. This is all in the sort of Andrew Tate. We have this distorted, I mean, that truly is toxic masculinity, right? I think a heroic masculinity is somewhere in the middle between these two, because it actually offers the challenge that is needed so that men can really develop their powers of self-denial and of purpose, direction, leadership, heroism, but in a way that is attuned to their own long-term interests and also the good of the community around them. It's in the role of service. And we haven't talked a lot about scripture, but Jesus says in John 15, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friends. And so there is a kind of Christian aspect of heroism as well. And we need to recover that, because the idea that there's just no challenge in life, we just, as I say, just sit on the couch absorbing the media and have, during our off time, there has to be something more to aspire to in life than that. But on the other hand, we don't want people to go in this toxic direction.
Yeah. Very wise words there. I definitely think that a call to self-denial would be a very good solution for a lot of this. Well, Dr. McClymond, the last question I've got for you here is, do you have any final parting advice that you would like to give to our audience?
Well, I think that we're all, the Lord puts us all on this earth for a purpose. And I think that the greatest experience of life for man is going to be a sense of coming to clarity about one's own purpose and one's own calling. And I think that that we need to engage individually in a discernment process, but also in communication with others. We don't discover this all on our own. That I would say any younger men that are listening to this, it would be important to talk with your family members, with your friends, with a pastor, a spiritual leader, about, like, what do you see as the strength that I might have to offer? and how can I cultivate that? And to think long term, because it's possible within our culture just to go with the flow of what is happening around us, and not to think, where do I want to be a year or 5 or 10 years from now? And it's easy to look on from a distance and to admire someone who's achieved something, but we're only going to achieve those things if we have a plan to do so. And typically that's going to involve that element of self-denial, saying no, things that we might want to do right here and now, in order that we can say yes to those things that are really important in the long term, and even important eternally.
Yeah, that's been a constant lesson for my life. Learning different languages and then losing a bunch of weight, having to do these things that are hard in order to gain something. And also, I assume getting a PhD is very hard, and that you have to, set aside time in the now in order to do something better in the future, right?
Well, it's self-directed, yeah. And fortunately, I haven't had too many, but there have been students that kind of gave up, a couple who gave up in the process. And honestly, what you discovered too is once you do a PhD, that's just the ticket into the room. And then as soon as you get in that room with other PhDs, so what have you done since then? So everything's relative, in terms of like what counts as success or an achievement.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. McClymond. Remember, if you have any questions you want to submit to the podcast, feel free to fill out the Google form that's going to be attached into the description. Also, if you want to be a guest, or if you know someone that you think would be a great guest, please fill out the Google form that's also listed below the question one. Remember, you can find us on Twitter at Remaining Sane PC, and have a blessed rest of your day.